Hi, I'm Dr. Vanda Vaporska, and this is Inequality Bites.
This is poetry redefined, sagas from the left behind, novels of a different kind. Need to make you state of mind. Look how Oscar minds are getting sent down to time. Take a look at our strengths all combined.
This is Inequality Bites, the podcast where we discuss how we can make society more equal so that everyone can flourish. In this series, we'll speak not only to experts on a range of different inequalities, but vitally also to those at the sharp end of inequality. Inequality Bites is created by the Equality Trust, the charity working to improve quality of life in the UK by reducing social and economic inequality, because more equal societies are better for us all. In today's episode, we're delighted to be talking to May Gabriel from It's OK campaign. During her teenage years, May was admitted to hospital on several occasions while suffering from severe depression. She's been a formative voice on youth and student mental health for the past 9 years, speaking on radio, television, and in print about mental illness. She's a seasoned public speaker. In 2018, she was elected as a Sussex Students' Union Welfare Officer and represented the welfare needs of over 18,000 students. During this time, she began to transform the mental health landscape at the university and set up a student-led tea and talk peer support network, where trained students offered support to other students. In 2019, May began working as a project manager for Rethink Mental Illness, a leading mental health charity in the UK. Here, she runs a university mental health scheme in 6 universities across London. May defines as a lesbian, disabled, woman of colour, and currently resides in London with her partner. Aside from mental health, her passions lie in LGBTQ+ rights and representation, as well as equality, diversity, and inclusion. Wow. Well, hi, May, and welcome to Inequality Bites, and thanks so much to you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
What an amazing CV. Well, and looking at that, I mean, it's clear you've been active and you've been an activist for a long time, but could you share with our listeners a little bit about your background and how and where you grew up?
So I grew up in Ladbroke Grove in West London in a single parent household and kind of attended the local state primary school. I'm still very good friends with many of the friends that I made there. At the age of 6, I'm just going to go through the kind of formative moments in my life. I feel that's the kind of best way for people to get to know me quite quickly. So at age 6, I developed a chronic tic disorder, which is essentially kind of non-verbal Tourette's. But if you hear any strange noises, it's probably me. And I still have that to this day, obviously. And around 8 years old or so, I started exhibiting kind of signs of depression. So I generally had quite a nice childhood, which was peppered with some quite difficult times. My dad had his own mental health and addiction issues, which I think probably impacted me in quite a profound way. My dad's Indonesian and my mother's English, but I'm kind of relatively ethnically ambiguous, while my brother, who's my full sibling, kind of passes as white. So I think for me, that probably caused some issues too, being the only brown person in my English family, given that my father wasn't really in my life. And that's something that I'm still kind of unpacking to this day. Another thing is kind of during my formative youth years, I found traditional and mainstream education quite difficult. And after primary school, I moved schools several times. At 16, I was diagnosed with being on the autistic spectrum and also with dyslexia, which probably contributed to my difficulties in mainstream education, especially as I wasn't diagnosed till I was much older. So that's kind of my early childhood. I loved growing up in London. And when I moved out of London to Brighton, I was kind of, even in Brighton, very shocked by the lack of diversity in comparison to the West London that I grew up in. So in terms of my mental health journey, that kind of really started from kind of the age of 14, when I had quite a serious suicide attempt, which landed me in a psychiatric unit. And so for the next 3 years, I was in and out of the unit, and kind of that experience really formed the things that I care about and kind of fight for today. So overall, during that time, I spent about 10 months in hospital over 3 stints. So I had my 15th birthday in hospital and my 17th birthday in hospital. And then after that, I wasn't able to kind of go back into mainstream education. And so I attended independent colleges, which were funded by my local education authority, because none of the kind of local normal schools would take me on. And I think part of that was also because I was told when I was in hospital by the doctors that with kind of my mental illness and such, that I would never leave hospital. And their plan was to, as soon as I turned 18, to put me into like a residential living kind of hospital unit. And I fought against that, kind of decision. My mum helped me fight against that decision quite a lot, and ultimately I managed to get discharged from the hospital, and kind of since then I haven't been back, which is great for me. And I've gotten a degree, I've held down a job, and I've set up my own charity now, and so it's kind of nice to be able to look back and say that the doctors were very wrong.
That's such an incredible story and incredible experience. I feel like you've packed in so much that you probably should retire next week. Honestly, it's just really, really impressive. And I think, I usually ask people at this stage, when was the first time you noticed inequality? What was the thing that really hit you? And I think there are so many points that you've just described at which you could say that. But was there really one point at which you thought, I'm being treated differently. My life is changing because I'm being treated differently?
I've since I've known that I've been doing this podcast, I've kind of been thinking about that question. Kind of, what point was there a point? And I think for me, it's very difficult to pinpoint a moment. I think to some extent, I've always been aware that inequality existed, but from kind of both sides of the spectrum. So I spent the first few years of my life living in Indonesia in quite a small village on the outskirts of Jogja, and in comparison to our neighbours, we were relatively well off. I mean, we weren't particularly well off, but in in comparison to the people that lived around us. And I think so from a really young age, I was always aware that there was differences in people. And by the time that I was in primary school, I was already kind of an activist and what I'd probably now call an organiser. So if I saw things that I believed were wrong, for instance, if I didn't think that the school were handling something in the right way, I would be the one who kind of started a petition. I'd write speeches, I'd go to the head teacher, I'd get students and parents on board. So kind of I must have been a nightmare for the school management, but kind of that campaigning and activist kind of spirit is still very much there within me today. And so it's difficult to pinpoint a moment because I think it's very much part of me, kind of noticing and being very kind of sensitive to the inequalities that exist.
I think, as they say, you were born ready. You were born an activist. And as someone who led a playground strike, I wish we'd kind of been there sitting next to each other, sort of shaking up the whole school. I think we could have taken over primary schools at that point. In this series, we've heard from Professor Richard Wilkinson and Mainaka Shanmuganantha about the relationship between poor mental health and inequality as a wider societal issue. And you've touched upon how you noticed that in Indonesia. But what's your personal experience of that as a wider social issue?
So I think there are aspects of my kind of identity, quite a few aspects of my identity, which are considered minority, and kind of the intersections between them have probably impacted my own mental health in many different ways. So as you said, kind of being disabled, brown and queer, kind of all of them have brought issues that I've had to face. And I think if we kind of went through every example, we'd probably be here for quite a long time. But one of the things that is something that I've personally been reflecting on quite a lot in more recent times has kind of been that sense of homophobia when you're at school. So kind of I've been out now since the age of 19, and now it kind of feels like such a distant memory that I was ever scared to come out. But there was very much a point of quite a long time where I didn't feel comfortable with that. So kind of at school, there's just that relentless homophobia that kind of occurs. Slurs are just really common. They're just used as kind of a normal part of people's kind of lexicon. And any kid showing any signs of queerness at school is just kind of horrifically bullied. And that just seems to be how it is. I think in my school, one of the schools that I went to, which had over 1,000 people, there was only one person who was openly queer. And kind of now I see people online and kind of there are a lot of people who have come out now, but at the time nobody felt safe enough to do so. And I think definitely during that period, I internalised a lot of that homophobia and kind of placed that onto myself. And I think that kind of not being able to be authentic on myself and kind of not feeling safe to be myself up until the age of kind of 19 or so probably had a profound impact on me that I'm still unpacking today. I mean, by the time that I was in secondary school, I already knew that I was gay. And so that's quite a lengthy amount of time But kind of for me personally, the biggest inequalities that I've faced have actually been due to my mental illness, which has had a huge negative impact on me. So sometimes it's felt like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. People know that you have a mental illness and then they treat you negatively because of your mental illness, and then it further exacerbates your mental illness. And that's a cycle that I think is particularly common for people who kind of sit at the severe end of the kind of mental health spectrum, and also have kind of, as soon as someone's been in inpatient, I feel like there's definitely a kind of label there that's very difficult to remove. So when I was about 16 or 17, I went into hospital with suspected appendicitis, and they'd seen on my medical notes that I'd had kind of quite complex mental health issues. And for several days they refused to operate on me because they were convinced that I was lying. And they said so to my mum. And so it has kind of real profound impacts on my day-to-day life, that kind of label that is part of me and something that I'm not ashamed of, but other people react very negatively to.
And I think that's part of the big debate about getting parity of mental health with physical health, because there are real impacts, as you say. And I think, coupled with the lower degrees of access by Black and Asian communities, by poorer communities, the whole issue of health inequalities is perfectly wrapped up there. And I think, even though there have been great strides about people talking about their mental health, people saying that, there isn't any stigma anymore, we all know that there still is. And I think, obviously that is a lot of a lack of understanding. But, very often you still hear people saying, oh, depression, anxiety, people just need to pull themselves together. It's just, they're just feeling a bit sad or glum or whatever. And I suppose, for someone who hasn't experienced depression, could you tell us a little bit of what it feels like?
So depression is different for everyone, and I feel like people are constantly trying to find kind of creative ways to describe what depression feels like to others who don't experience it. And I think one of the best analogies that I found for my own depression is that it often feels like I'm in a boat with a huge hole in it. And that's kind of my normal. I'm in a boat that's kind of sinking, essentially. And when I'm really unwell and my depression is kind of at its worst, it feels as though I have kind of no tools to help me empty that water. It feels impossible. It feels as though it's an impossible task. I have no help. I have no support. I am just watching this boat sink. But when I'm slightly better, I feel that I kind of perhaps have like a bucket or something larger to help me remove that water and kind of stay afloat. So for me, it's still a huge amount of effort, but it's doable and it's possible. So as I said, I kind of have persistent and chronic depression, which I've had for over a decade now. So there's never not a hole in that boat for me. But for some people, if you use that boat analogy, sometimes they might not have a hole and they might just be
Thanks
kind of
for
bobbing
listening to
along
Inequality
absolutely
Bites.
fine.
If you're enjoying today's podcast, would you consider donating the cost of a cup of coffee or lunch to the Equality Trust? This will help us to support young people to speak truth to power, to campaign on key issues like fair and equal pay, and to produce more online content like this podcast to raise awareness of the damage that inequality causes and how we can reduce this, because inequality is not inevitable. I've never heard it put so we understand that not everyone can donate, and I think so if you can't, then please visit our website to sign up to our mailing list, take action on our latest campaigns, and follow us on social media. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
And, the choppiness of that sea are the other circumstances that contribute to our mental health, whether it's our sexual orientation, whether it's prejudice, whether it's discrimination, whether it's poor economic circumstances or family circumstances. But I think you've absolutely put that perfectly. Thank you. So you founded the It's Okay campaign at the age of 16. Can you tell us about the campaign and why you felt it was needed?
So when I first set up the It's Okay campaign, and it was years ago now, there weren't really any young people talking about their experiences of mental illness. So prior to me going into hospital, I had felt very alone. I thought that what I was going through was very kind of individual, that nobody else was experiencing what I was going through. But as soon as I went into hospital, I found that there were so many other people who had experiences that were kind of extraordinarily similar to mine. Even though we were all very different, we all came from very different backgrounds, we weren't alone in our journeys with our mental health. And I think that was a really comforting feeling for me. So when I came out of hospital, I was really keen to create a space in a community where people would be able to understand that they weren't alone. And that was essentially what it started with. It was me sharing my story in the hopes that someone might not feel so alone, or someone might recognize some of that story in themselves and maybe kind of get the help that they need sooner than I got the help. I didn't, because for me, I didn't get the help. I didn't really know what was happening. I became very unwell very quickly. And that kind of all culminated in an attempt of suicide, which I ended up straight into hospital. There was never kind of conversations with people about it. But so when I set it up, this was kind of before Instagram. So it was a blog and a Twitter account. And at the time, I didn't really expect for it to get as big as it did. But I think I was very much one of the first young people to start being open about those mental health experiences. It's amazing now if you go online, there are kind of thousands and thousands of young people sharing their stories and trying to kind of build that community. And then over time, I wanted to work to kind of reduce the stigma around teenage depression more specifically. So I started writing and sharing more content for perhaps kind of like parents and carers and teachers of young people, to make sure that people could spot the signs of it's not just a kind of grumpy teenager phase. You know, there actually might be something worse going on. And then over the years, kind of where we are now, my kind of work that I want to do is more reducing the stigma and supporting those living at the more severe end of mental illness, but all within young people. Young people is kind of my experience. And so I feel like that's the area that I can help the most.
And I think, as a parent, that's something that, we do dread. We look at our children and think, is this just grumpiness? Is this just overtiredness, or is there a pattern emerging? And, I think it's in a lot of people's minds. So I'm sure that any parents out there listening who are worried about their children will look at the campaign and find some resources there to support them. But when we speak about mental health, what do you think are the most common mistakes people make, and how can we get better at talking about it?
So I think for me, a big mistake is that people kind of often conflate mental health and mental illness, kind of almost talking as if they're the same thing. Just as everyone has physical health, everybody has mental health. And I think that that's always a good starting point for people to understand that you can have good mental health, you can have poor mental health, and you can also have kind of ill mental health. But I think most mistakes come from a lack of knowledge. So I think there's quite an easy fix there in that you can educate yourself. So online, there's a huge wealth of resources and information that people can access. I mean, even if it's just facts about different mental disorders, kind of just the symptoms of different mental illnesses, or reading up about people's experiences or own personal experiences with mental illness, just being able to educate yourself so you're not coming from a place where you expect the person that you're trying to talk to about mental health to educate you. But aside from educating yourself, I think one of the biggest things that people can do when talking to others about their mental health is just listen. Often when someone tries to talk about their own mental health, people rush to try and come up with like solutions or cures for their kind of illness or problem, which is so unhelpful. So most of the time, people who are offering the advice aren't professionals and they don't have the same experience. So sometimes, or kind of often, what I say to people is it's okay to just listen and say, that's rubbish and I'm sorry and I'm here for you. And you tell me if there's anything that I can do, instead of sending them like 100 links about like cures for depression. And I think kind of starting there is going to be really important if you're trying to talk to someone about their mental health.
And I think people will be listening and thinking that's not just applying to mental health. There's a whole load of areas where people do rush in to fix with a solution, and sometimes you just really want them to listen. We can see that COVID has had a negative effect on many people's mental health. But recently, obviously, the focus has been on students and universities and the situation that students have been in. So you were a welfare officer at Sussex University. Can you tell us a bit more about the issues that students suffer? And how does technology exacerbate young people's mental health issues?
So in my conversations with students recently, the biggest issue that seems to have come from COVID is the isolation that they're experiencing, but also the lack of separation between study and life seems to have been really difficult. A lot of students are living, studying and working in one room. There's lots of student accommodation, particularly in London, where most of the students that I talk to live. There's no social space within a house. So it is your bedroom and a kitchen, perhaps probably a very small kitchen. And so there's no separation in life, and people are finding that really difficult to cope with. I think in many ways, technology can enable and increase access and participation to lectures and courses at universities, which I think is really amazing. But at the same time, having to fully rely on technology and losing that human interaction could be really lonely. And there's also a big question mark, which I don't think we know the answer to yet, which is what the impact of having student services online will be for students. So, for instance, online video counselling or online video dyslexia mentoring. We don't know what the impact on students will be yet. I think this year students are having it the hardest that there's been, particularly kind of in the past 7 years that I've been involved within higher education. So especially those who are in first year and in halls. Universities are having to adapt to situations really quickly with kind of lockdowning of halls, etc. But I don't think that universities are necessarily considering the impact on the students' mental health, which to me personally should be at the forefront of all the decisions that they're making. Obviously, the students' kind of physical safety, but also mental safety. And also, I think in terms of the technology, I think there's a wider conversation about how this can exacerbate mental health issues. So online and social media can be really good and helpful for young people to find their communities and kind of support with mental health and mental illness. So for instance, at It's Okay, 2 of our youth advisory board members, someone with an account called Recovery Connor, and then Joshua, who runs an account called Really JB, they run really amazing and helpful Instagram accounts which educate other young people about the signs of symptoms and disorders, and they signpost them to get appropriate support and help, and it's really responsible in the way that they run their accounts. And I think it's really helpful to the kind of thousands of young people that they support through their content. But at the same time, there's really dark and dangerous corners of the internet, which 100% would exacerbate mental health problems. And I think it's important that for young people, there's that education around use of technology. And I think ultimately as well, social media companies have a bigger part to play in safeguarding the mental health of young people.
Thanks for listening to Inequality Bites. If you're enjoying today's podcast, would you consider donating the cost of a cup of coffee or lunch to the Equality Trust? This will help us to support young people to speak truth to power, to campaign on key issues like fair and equal pay, and to produce more online content like this podcast to raise awareness of the damage that inequality causes and how we can reduce this, because inequality is not inevitable. We understand that not everyone can donate, so if you can't, then please visit our website to sign up to our mailing list, take action on our latest campaigns, and follow us on social media. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
So you've recently turned the campaign into an intersectional organisation. Can you tell us about why you feel that that's needed now?
Yes, so we recently registered It's Okay as a charity, which is really exciting. We have an amazing board of trustees and an incredible youth advisory board, as well as a group of volunteers who are passionate about making the lives of young people living with mental illness better. The charity sector, as I'm sure many people know, isn't a kind of particularly diverse or inclusive place. And you only need to look at campaigns like Charity So White to see how huge the problem is. So in the past 10 years or so since I've been in the world of youth mental health, I didn't see a charity which represented me as a queer, brown, disabled person with severe mental illness. And so I set it up. A charity like It's Okay has always been needed. I guess now it's needed more than ever, but there's never not been the need for it. And I think I had an assumption that somebody else would set up an organisation like this, and it didn't happen. And so it's got to the point now where I feel more prepared to run an organisation with the support of kind of my amazing trustees. But I think the mental health third sector desperately needs an organisation which is built on foundations of intersectionality and understanding of minorities. So those aren't just added on as an afterthought, but are fully embedded in all the work that we do. Additionally, there isn't a charity which specifically focuses on young people at the more severe end of the mental health spectrum. And so it seemed as though it needed to be set up. And so we did it.
And although this is a podcast, if you could see the visuals, you would just have seen me nodding away like the proverbial nodding donkey there, because I just absolutely agree with everything you said. And we've really seen that people are stepping up, and people are having to do this because the mainstream charities are not necessarily tackling these issues and don't necessarily have that expertise, and as you say, are using it as an add-on very often, and that's simply not good enough. And I'm really pleased to see over the last couple of years a lot more intersectional approach to many issues, because at the Equality Trust, we are really all about the fact that these things intersect, that ethnicity intersects with economic disadvantage or advantage, intersects with geography and health inequalities, and all of these issues are part and parcel of the environment that we all live in. So I think that's absolutely fantastic. And, we really, really do need more organisations that are thinking at that more complex and more nuanced level. So on Inequality Bites, we like to discuss the vital problems, but also the solutions. In the years since you started It's Okay, we've seen mental health go from a peripheral issue to a mainstream media. And you make this point in a recent blog, why we need to stop talking about mental health. How can we move from talking about mental health to action in the next years?
So this is a question that I mull over and over and have been doing now for years. It's really difficult. In many ways now, mental health is very in vogue and people are talking about it more openly, and the level of public stigma in the press and the media has massively reduced. But what is the kind of real impact of this on real people who are suffering with mental illness? And I don't know the answer to that. That's a very kind of rhetorical question. The amazing campaign Time to Change has played a massive part in changing perceptions of mental health over the past decade or so, but the government have recently chosen to not renew their funding, and the campaign ends in March 2021. So it'll be put upon smaller mental health organisations to continue pushing the anti-stigma work, because although we've made strides in the level of stigma, there's still huge stigma that exists around mental illness, particularly disorders such as personality disorders or schizophrenia. Talking about mental health is important, but there's no support or help available for those who are talking about mental health, and things won't improve, especially for those who are at the more severe end of the spectrum. So in the next few years, I would hope to see more investment in mental health provision and support. I would hope to see patient-centred support, which is more holistic. These are things that are all in the NHS long-term plan. So I think as individuals and organisations, we need to make sure that the recommendations are being followed through. As individuals, I think we still need to talk about mental health. But as I said in that blog title, we need to stop talking about mental health. So much of people talking about mental health is them saying, it's really important to speak up and talk to people. It's okay to talk, as opposed to them actually opening up and talking about their mental health and reducing stigma in that way. If people are open about their own mental health, that serves to make others feel less alone. But ultimately, support and provision is the most vital thing that we need.
And I think also on that note, it's, there are marked differences about how the media and others react to different types of people talking about their mental health. We know where the discrimination is there in terms of who is allowed to talk about their poor mental health or mental illness and who isn't. So I think it's really not very encouraging for certain groups of people. As someone who's passionate about addressing population mental health, what do you think the sector could do better?
There is so much that the mental health sector can do better, but I'm going to split it into two parts. So the kind of mental health care providers and the third sector. So I touched on it previously, but healthcare providers, primarily the NHS, need to step up their game. None of the care is holistic, and none of it looks at the situational and environmental factors that might be playing a part in someone's poor mental health. The stigma within the sector is appalling. You would think perhaps that mental health professionals wouldn't be stigmatising, but in my experience, they have been some of the worst. That's a huge generalisation that I'm making. And although there are amazing people who work within the sector, the experiences that I have had have kind of left a huge mark on me. A lot of the time, the support received isn't appropriate, and the psychiatric units don't often feel fit for purpose. Again, this is all my own personal opinion, and other people will probably have had different experiences to me. But one of the first campaigns that I want to organise with It's OK is going to be to stop the use of physical restraint in young people's psychiatric units. So in my dissertation, which I completed in my final year of university, which explored the retrospective experiences of young people who'd been admitted into hospital for depression, 100% of the participants who had been in the adolescent psychiatric units experienced or witnessed use of excessive physical restraint and violence from staff members towards young people. And one of the participants got several broken bones from a staff member's physical restraint. That to me is one of the kind of easiest quick fixes that we need to make, because in adolescent units, all the young people are usually from the age of 12 to 17. You get kicked out on your 18th birthday, and it is not appropriate. I mean, physical restraint I don't necessarily feel is appropriate most of the time, but often you'll have a 14-year-old with 5 fully grown members of staff on top of them, which I think is appalling, and it's something that I've experienced and witnessed. And the fact that it's still continuing to this day is appalling. In terms of the third sector, though, and the improvements that the third sector could make, again, I touched on this slightly previously, but the mental health charity sector has to improve its diversity. We cannot represent the people we need to if we are not run by the people that we need to represent. Mental illness disproportionately impacts so many minority groups, yet the sector seems to be made up with the same demographic of people who aren't necessarily from minority groups. I think as this starts to shift, the sector will improve, and I think we'll really start helping and supporting the people that it needs to help and support.
So how can we empower young people to define the policy and services that they use when it comes to mental health? Because obviously not every 16-year-old is brilliant enough to start their own campaigning organisation.
There are a few things that I've thought of for young people to get engaged. So the first one that I'm going to say is going to be a bit of a plug for It's OK. So as It's OK grows, we've only actually been registered for 4 weeks, so we're still very young. We'll have more and more opportunities for young people to get involved in, and we'll soon have some volunteer openings. So if people want to keep an eye out on that, they can follow us online on social media. We're at It's OK Charity. But we're going to be an organisation which will be led and driven by young people. So we're really keen to get as many young people with lived experience on board as possible. At our charity, young people will be driving the change and driving the campaigns and driving everything. It's a young people-led charity, what else can I say? But also, aside from that, if young people are under CAMS or adult mental health services, those services often have patient involvement groups, so they might not be advertised, but talk to the receptionist, talk to your therapist, see if they're there, and usually there's openings and you can get involved with them. They're a really good way to get your voice heard and potentially make small improvements within your service. And also, if you're a university student, go to your students' union, talk to your welfare officer, set up a campaign and get involved. Student politics and student campaigning is really impactful and will really help make your time at university. It did for me, at least. But then also, if you're in school and want to change how your school is dealing with mental illness or the mental health of students, write a letter, start a petition, kind of bring your friends together with a common goal. I feel like often people underestimate that kind of power of grassroots local action, particularly within a school community, but it is so impactful and effective, and you have the power to make the change that you want to see.
Thank you for listening to Inequality Bites, the podcast exploring not just the damage that inequality is causing, but also the solutions, so that we can create a more equal society that's better for everyone. In our next episode, we'll be speaking to Dr. Fran Darlington-Pollock, who'll be discussing the links between inequality and life expectancy, infant mortality, obesity and stress. Fran will discuss why life expectancies vary so widely across wards and boroughs in the UK, and just what COVID-19 has shown us about inequality in health.
If we're no longer seeing improvements to our life expectancy, the ultimate marker of health, what is going on in society? How is that society not flourishing? And when you're seeing inequalities in that, so it's not just a kind of unilateral stop, it's that some people in some places are losing years whilst others perhaps are ticking along okay. That's a real crisis. That's a social crisis and a moral crisis and a political one.
Let us know what you thought on Twitter. Subscribe, like and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Acast, or whatever platform you're listening on, and tell your friends. See you next time for Inequality Bites.